Wisniowski, Director of Kresy-Siberia Group. Stefan Wisniowski, President of the Kresy-Siberia Group. Jagna, Australian Institute of Polish Affairs. Exiles, Australian Institute of Polish Affairs. Count and Countess George and Primrose Kresy-Siberia. And Sash Campbell. It's good to see you all here. We hope that you'll find this evening both informative and enjoyable. To set the context for tonight's panel discussion, please welcome Krzysztof and Zosia.
Mr. Vice President Marble, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Among the great tragedies that befell Poland during World War II was the forced deportation of citizens by the Soviet Union during the first Soviet occupation of the eastern regions of that country between 1939 and 1941. The brutal ethnic cleansing campaign involved transporting by rail in locked cattle trucks the families of everybody who was anybody in the war Poland to the most inhospitable areas of the Soviet Union. In all, more than 1 million people were relocated in the first two deportations, of which around 83,000 were Polish Jews. As the first two deportations took place in early spring of 1940, that's in February and April, it was bitterly cold and hardly any food was provided. The journey took between 2 and 3 weeks, depending on the destination. Arkhangelsk, the district or North Kazakhstan. A number of people died in this human environment, especially the very young, into the real. The corpses were removed with a trash stopped occasionally in the station, and there was no way of knowing how they were disposed. No time to breathe or leaving or saying goodbye. Most men were arrested and consigned to the GULAGs before the deportations began. The officers of those units of the Polish armed forces who surrendered to the Red Army in autumn of 1939, numbering around 22,000, were mostly concentrated in 3 prisoner of war camps in Zosia, Skarbek, and Stefan, and then some of them executed in Kharkiv, Kharkov, and Tver during April and May of 1940. They were mostly reserve officers, in civilian life, university professors, doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, business people, the elite of the nation. To the Soviet people, to the Soviet ethnicity or religion were of no consequence. So as well as the ethnic Poles, there were among them Polish Jews, Russians, Ukrainians, Tatars, and Armenians. The word Poland was indeed a multicultural society. Among the 4,500 Polish officers from Wojciech's camp murdered in Kharkiv, 450 were Jews. Most of them were young sub-lieutenants or lieutenants, but there were some of higher rank, ranging up to colonel. In civilian life, doctors, veterinarians, pharmacists, and other professions. The medical professions were especially prominent. The Jews were especially prominent in the medical services of the Polish army. Among the army chaplains murdered in Kharkiv was Major Baruch Steinberg, chief rabbi of the Polish army, an exceptional man, and a great Polish patriot who under Marshal Józef Piłsudski fought for Polish independence during the First World War. Many civilian deportees died in the Soviet Union from starvation, disease, and inhuman working conditions. Some froze to death. Of those who survived, the lucky ones left the Soviet Union with the Polish army under the command of General Wrocław, which was formed after Germany invaded the Soviets found themselves by accident on the same side as the Western Allies. Others returned to Poland under communist domination after the war ended. Some were not let out until 1956. But that is another story too long to be related tonight. I am grateful to Easy Marmor for inviting me to share those memories with you, because it is also my story, as I was, together with my mother, one of those deportees at the age of 4 and a half.
Now I'd like to please welcome Wisniowska, who will introduce tonight's film, The Forgotten Odyssey.
Thank you, Izzy. I'd very much like to introduce a film that we're going to show tonight called The Forgotten Odyssey, which was made in 2000. It's a courageous and seminal piece of work in that it documented for the first time this chapter of history. It was 8 years in the making, and the reason that it took so long to make was because nobody was interested in telling the story. When they approached funders, Aneta, Naszynska and Jagna, Wright, the funders said, no one wants to hear this story, nobody is interested. I was born in 1960, and I grew up with war documentaries and I studied Russian history at school, but there was no mention of this chapter of history when I was growing up. My father, who was a survivor, did mention it occasionally, and there are fragments of information that we got at the dinner table, such as the freezing cold in Siberia, the starvation, his deadly seriousness around food and finishing your dinner. There are other clues around what happened that I was later able to piece together. My father's missing teeth, which I later found out were as a result of scurvy. My missing grandfather, who I found out later was a result of having been arrested by the NKVD, and he's never been seen again. There's a big scar on my grandma's face from being in the camps, I assume from a boil or something as a result of scurvy. And her digging through our rubbish bins every week to see whether there was something that she could find that she could eat or use in her house. It was only about 10 years ago that I was able to start putting the pieces together when I started talking to my great auntie, who at that time was still alive and living in Poland, and she thought that they had the freedom to speak for the first time about what had happened. However, this story, the story of 1.7 million Poles who were deported, is still largely untold and still largely unknown. This particular piece of work led to the creation of the Kresy-Siberia group, which is dedicated to the legacy that Aneta, Naszynska and Jagna Wright left. Sadly, Jagna and Aneta are no longer with us, but they left behind for us a fantastic legacy for our group to build upon. And what we want to do as a group is to tell this story. We're also keen to find survivors and to interview them about their experiences. It's not by accident that we don't know about this chapter of history. The Soviets were very good at making sure that they picked the most remote locations with the most extreme weather conditions. You have the high attrition rate in the camps. In some places it was up to 85% mortality rate if you managed to survive beyond a year. We also have the political situation and the lack of photographic evidence. And towards the end of the terror, we have the NKVD imprisoning its own, the guards, so that they couldn't tell what happened. I just wanted to read a little quote from a book here about the importance of documentary evidence. One significant difference about this experience was the lack of photographic evidence ever to emerge from the Gulag, nor was it accidental, since photography within the wide Soviet Union, let alone the camps, was always one of the most heavily prescribed activities, guaranteed to lead to swift arrest unless overseen by the NKVD. And without photographic evidence of their victims, the essential inhumanity of the Soviet camps never fully entered into the Western public's consciousness, where such issues were open to judgment. Later, the written evidence from the survivors might be understood intellectually, and their drawings and sketches from memory acknowledged. But as was undoubtedly true in Nuremberg, it was only the photographic evidence which elicited true comprehension from all parties, irrespective of their politics. We trust, it seems, only with our eyes. I hope that when you watch this documentary, you listen to the first-hand accounts of those who survived, and we would encourage others to do so.
Stephen is PhD in Soviet economic history and teaches at the University of Melbourne in the School of Historical and Philosophical Science. Sophie Skarbek is coming. Sophie is the president of the Kresy-Siberia Association of Victoria. Stefan Wisniowski. President of the Kresy-Siberia Foundation. And Kinst. Krystyna's parents were transported to the Alden camps in Yakutsk, USSR. Now, after the panel discussion ends, there will be a short questions and answer segment. And hopefully we'll get some good questions and answers. Thank you.
I think what we'll do is each of the panel will speak for probably about 2 minutes. The non-academic.
Speak out, please.
Speak to the microphone.
Microphone.
Hello, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm a non-poll academic, and I will be giving you a view of representing what the academic world has been doing with this. You've heard the accusation that in fact it's a forgotten Odyssey that has been much ignored in the teaching and in the presentation of these events. I felt slightly uneasy about that, but I think as Louis said at the beginning, there's I think perhaps a difference between the popular knowledge and to some extent the sort of academic knowledge. I think, as was pointed out in the film, there was knowledge amongst many groups. I must say I thought the film was absolutely tremendous in the humanity and understanding that it showed. How people who had suffered quite extraordinary humanities could still, nevertheless, be so openly understanding the way at the beginning people were saying, well, of course, the British didn't acknowledge that it was in the middle of the war. Of course, the big priority at the time was to win the war. What else could be done? I thought that was shown quite extraordinary humanity and understanding. Something, in fact, I thought that Professor Norman Davies at the end was slightly missing in, and I think it's very important from academic points of view to work out what is acceptable in a war when the main priority is more or less to win. Churchill did say, I'll drink soup with the devil if need be, and under those circumstances I think we do. I think it to be a little bit fair to the British, I think it does have to be pointed out that when the Soviets wanted to lay the charge at Nuremberg of the attacking murders against the Germans, the British and the Americans refused to let that happen. So there was, this is why I think Norman Davies said that they were trying to bury it forever. If they really were trying to bury it forever, you wouldn't have done that. So there was a slightly bit of principle, and I think I remember from my youth going to, in fact, Polish house in London and finding out what was happening. I can remember actually being very much amazed. I used to go to Russia by train and by boat. Why was it that the Harwich to Hook boat had all the languages in Polish, Dutch, and English, not in German? It was very clear. I was educated in the British Netherlands. Everybody knew the Polish Air Force was based in Stafford. We had less dealings with, obviously, the other groups. But there was, I think, a bit of popular knowledge, and I don't think that it really was anything like as covered up, I think, in the historical book. But there was, I think, during the war, difficulties understanding what was going on. I don't want to speak for very long. I think I said that, of course, it is part of a general pattern of Soviet terror against different ethnic communities, different communities within the Soviet Union itself. I spoke earlier, in fact, to the Institute of Polish Affairs, arguing that, in fact, Polish operations in the Purge, this is against Soviet Polish citizens, but against many other ethnicities, Germans, actually Koreans, all of the border areas, anyone who could be accused of potentially doing anything were extraordinarily severe and did involve ethnic things. And I even think something that, in cultural terms, within certainly sort of ethnic Polish community within the Soviet Union could be described as genocide. And they were, I think, what we saw in the Second World War was a continuation of that same kind of mentality forward. But you don't want to hear me, I'm just explaining the way that I from an academic point of view, I am a little bit worried about the figures that are being bandied about. We saw 1.7 million on the film. Our distinguished president here gave the figure of 1 million. I have looked in some detail with the vast amount of material that now come out from joint Polish-Russian historians searching the archives, and they find it very difficult to come up with figures more than 600,000 for those who were, if you like, deported through the deportation channels. I think 1.7 million probably is a bit of a sort of loose description of total numbers of citizens from Poland who did move into the Soviet Union. I think there is difficulty finding those figures. But, I mean, it's such an enormous humanity. I think the film captures it very well with it. And I think it does that by bringing to life some of the personal stories that can be turned out in some of the local persons. So, Sophie. Yeah.
Good afternoon or good evening. As you know already, I'm one of the survivors of the deportation to Siberia. At present, the president of those who survived and live in Victoria, there are about 16 members. Pretty active. We meet quite often. Sometimes to talk about the past, often just to get together, basically. But when the war started, I was 3 years old. I actually turned 3 on the 11th of August, 1939. My father was called to maneuvers 3 days after my birthday. So actually the war more or less started for us quite early. My father was a school inspector in Army Reserve, a second lieutenant. From time to time he would come home for a very short time and tell us to get as many things, to buy as much as we possibly could, because he knew something was going to happen and that we should have provisions. And then, of course, after the 17th of September 1939, we didn't hear from him for a long time. I think the first letters that came were from Koziels. And I was amazed that they actually allowed prisoners to write families. And as for things like leather for his shoes, it was better. Koziels was a terrible place. It was terribly wet and humid and cold, and the leather shoes were just disintegrating. So that's what he was asking for. Also telling us not to worry that he will be back and that I can cook him dinner. So these are memories which I faintly recall, which my mother told me. And it's a family history. It's like a dream in a way for me, because I'm not sure how much I remember. We were taken to Russia on the 14th of April. That's the second lot. As usual, what happened was at about 5 o'clock in the morning there was a knock on our door, and an NCOMT. We were lucky, we got an officer who seemed to be slightly human. And he said to my mother, "Don't worry, because where you're going, you meet your father, you meet your husband and the children's father." We were amazed. And then he said, "Take as much cold, warm things as you possibly can, because where you're going is going to be very cold." So then of course we had a soldier and be standing with a rifle. We packed as much as we could. That's my mother, my brother, who's 5 years older than me, lives in Perth, and my aunt was visiting us. And our journey to the Soviet Russia started then. Can I mention that Łancucki was in the same way as I? We traveled together. We lived in the same house. So when Krzysztof left Soviet Russia a bit earlier than me, I cried. And I don't know why we left earlier, because there was absolutely no one who could come and get us as a soldier's family. Until some poor Polish soldier who was sent, Polish soldiers were sent out to basically crisscross Russia to see if there are any families in various villages, and he found us. My mother says that he was in such a state, she's not sure how much further he could get. But he put us down as his family. So after the amnesty, we were given a little card which said, yes, we can move around Russia. But it wasn't quite that easy. We had to go to the NKVD office and for a hearing, so to speak. And because there were 4 of us, my aunt was 53, so they called her an old woman. They asked my mother, "What are you going to do in the army?" She said, "I'm going to carry the rifle." And my brother, I think he was 8 then, no, 10. And he said he's going to play in the army orchestra. They somehow swallowed that. They said to my aunt, "What are you going to do?" And she said, "I'm going to cook." And they looked at me and just like this and said, "Yes, you can go as well." So we followed all the steps that other people did from northern Kazakhstan to Uzbekistan to join the Polish army. My brother actually joined the army as a 10-year-old boy, and they gave him a drum, and he played, and he did that. He did, and before he actually got this great role to lead the army, he had to go through a hearing test, whether he wasn't deaf, through a singing test to see that he could carry the tunes necessary. He passed everything. And so he was always at the front of the Polish defilada.
Great.
And leaving the soldiers behind him. And then after Russia, we went to Tehran, where we stayed for about 9 months. From Tehran through Akbas, we went to Karachi. In Karachi, there was a huge, very, very big camp. This is when we first met American and English soldiers. And I don't go there one time. And I must say, they were very kind to us. They gave us as much as they possibly could. They took us children to their various camps so we could perform choreography and dancing in our costumes, who we somehow or other mothers made costumes for us. From then, we were taken to India, Balivade, for 5 years. My mother was a teacher, so she was teaching all the time, basically. Polish school started much, much earlier in Akbas already. Balivade, India was a very good camp for us. We stayed there for 5 years until India got its independence, and it wasn't really convenient to keep us there anymore. We were then transported to Africa, Uganda, and stayed there for 2 years. And finally, Australia. People from Australia came looking for migrants, and we came here. And I think that's it, and we're very happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can you hear that? Okay. Good evening, everybody, and it's an honor to be here with you today. I've come down from Sydney. Don't be fooled by the accent. I was born in Montreal after 1960, but I'm a second generation, I guess, as we put it, survivor, because my father was 9 years old in February 1940 when he was deported with his family from a town it was a small settlement just outside the town of Brody, which many of you know, eastern Poland, was between Lvov and Tarnovo, and it was really in that kind of area. Formerly on the border of the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire of Galicia, so right on the border. And in fact, our land was on the border with the former Russian Empire. So the interesting thing for me about this is, as a sort of second generation person, I've been involved with the Kresy-Siberia group for 10 years now, and through the power of the internet, people started reaching out to each other to compare stories, and everything that I've learned about this experience in the last 10 years, I really learned through my involvement with the group. I didn't really know about it from my father, because he wouldn't talk about his history. He was a young boy, but as with survivors often is the case, they either obsess and talk about it constantly, and you can tend to turn off, or other people cope with these kind of traumatic experiences by moving on and saying, well, why dredge up the past? You know, I've got a new life, I've started, I'm not going to really dwell in the past. And I think maybe that's part of the phenomenon that Stephen was alluding to, is sometimes it's really the question of memory and collective or historical memory that we're talking about here. People like Zosia, of course, know her experience, and in the Polish community, what had happened was well known. Most families in Poland have somebody from Eastern Poland. I mean, statistically, half your country was taken over by the Soviets, the other half by the Nazis. You're going to know somebody who was in the eastern half, statistically speaking. So most people knew. But I think the thing that really struck me when I turned 40 and I had kids, I started getting curious about my parents' history, especially my father's history of deportation. And my grandfather died actually after they were released, so that was unfortunately. I had an aunt who died on her 16th birthday of typhus, already after they crossed the Caspian Sea into Iran. And my uncle, who was 15, got snow blindness, which was like, if anyone can see Peter Weir's film, they showed the snow blindness, which is what he got from malnutrition and no medical attention and so on. He was sort of blinded by that. So at 9 years old, my father ended up being the oldest male in the family and also enrolled into the army. I guess they needed a cadet. They didn't have any more drugs to give out Zosia, so he became a cadet. But because he was enrolled in the army, the family was able to be transported out of the USSR with the Polish army. And so that's really why I'm here. I owe that to the fact that I grew up in the West and I've lived in Australia for 15 years. I'm very fortunate. Actually, if my father hadn't been deported, I probably would have, he would have met my mother, but how this works. So I'm fortunate that it happened, but it was a terrible traumatic experience for him and for the rest of my family that was really just not talked about. This is a little bit of a maybe nuance on this idea, was the story really well known or not well known? And it comes back to this issue of collective memory. During the war, when the Polish people found themselves in the Middle East, the Polish citizens, who include Jewish people as well. I mean, Menachem Begin was one of the people who made it out with his army, and there were other notable Polish Jews as well. Not so many, but maybe 6,000 or 7,000, 8,000 of the army. They were described in the press as refugees from Nazi aggression. So it wasn't actually said, hey, these are the people who were captured when Russia, in its alliance with Hitler, when the Soviet Union in its alliance with Hitler invaded Poland, and they were working in the slave labor camps for the last 2 years, and now they've been released because Hitler turned on Stalin. These are refugees from Nazi German aggression. So, and again, it's understandable during the war how the truth is the first casualty of war. But from a personal point of view, if you were a young Pole and were writing to your family and you were saying, well, we got out of the Soviet camps, those letters would be censored and those words would have been cut out by the British military. So there was actually active censorship going on about the story. And then it's about why after the war wasn't the story then told? The war was over, Hitler was defeated. The Soviets were the bad guys, right, from the West, so why didn't this all come out? In fact, there were congressional hearings in the U.S. on who did the Captain thing. There was the AFL-CIO, George Rooney, and the labor movement did studies of the GULAGs and things like that. But, there was nobody really to advocate on the Polish side because they were under Soviet control until 1989 for another 50 years. And you could get arrested, and in fact, many were arrested and sent to Siberia again in Poland for talking about this. So there was no real strong constituency. There was no nation state to speak for the Polish experience. And in the West, people didn't really, want to hear, or some people talked about it and their experiences weren't believed. What do you mean 8 rats in the Siberian tundra? You go back to work. That couldn't happen. And so maybe it's a subtle thing, and maybe it's psychological, and I'm not a psychologist or a sociologist or a doctor or anything like that. But when group psychology arose, there was a tremendous feeling that the people were finally given a voice to the survivors, and also those who didn't survive and whose bodies were thrown, by the wayside. My grandfather died in 1942 in January after being released, and we don't know where his body is. He died on a train journey, and Phil said, if you die, your body was basically thrown out to the sides, and quite often the wolves was just basically, that's how the wolves found their food. Often was the dead prisoners. You tried to bury them, the ground was so hard that you'd come back and the wolves had dug up. So this is part of the tragedy that on a personal level, these people have been feeling. And it's quite interesting, maybe a different topic, but the reason that this group arose, and you see the three R words there, research, remember, and recognize, is that those were the gaps that were felt. We felt, well, we don't really have information on this. It's not in the history books. Some historians, of course, would know about it, but it's not popularly known that this happened. The remembrance, the stories of the people like we heard in the film, and Zosia and others, in the audience and all around the world, in all these countries, never really got recorded, and part of our project was to do that. And finally, to give them the recognition. Just that they did go through this. They lost their homes, they lost their childhoods, they lost their country. In fact, many of them died before Poland became free in the end. And so they carried a little bit of Poland everywhere that they went, and I was a bit of a product of that childhood, these little artificial Polands that were carried around, because the real Poland was still under foreign domination. Maybe I'll just make one last sort of comment, which I think Stephen's quite right about the figures. We don't really know how many people were finally deported, and the other thing is about statistics. Statistics often always have to be defined, and so when you throw a number out, you actually have to have a lot of caveats. This number includes these people, not that people. I think that the number of somewhere between 1 or 2 million is actually Polish citizens of all nationalities that found themselves in captivity in the USSR and then became released by its amnesty. Because the Polish government had sent out delegations to, how will we help these people? Many were orphans, many were without the breadwinner, the husband, they didn't know where to go, So how many people were there? Somewhere between 1 and 2 million. How many were put into cattle cars at gunpoint? Probably that lower number, 500,000 or some number like that. Really, the debate over the numbers can fool us and divert us down the wrong paths. Really, what I've done to be a little bit of my mission, I'll wrap it up and pass it on to Krystyna to talk about it, has really been those 3 R's to help support research, remembrance, and recognition that this happened. And importantly, it happened to people because they were Polish citizens and enemies of the Soviet state. Whether they were Polish, Jewish, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Armenian, as Krzysztof pointed out, they were all building a kind of multinational country and trying to find a way to work together and live together between the wars for Poland, which was just a new state that had arisen after hundreds of years being under occupation, essentially. It was a new country, and these nationalities were trying to live together in kind of this melting pot. And so that's our philosophy as well. We're open, we're inclusive, and one of the reasons I'm so pleased to be here with you today is I feel it's really important for the Polish Jews to understand and build bridges with us and understand their side of the experience. They can understand our side, and then we build these bridges of common understanding through some very difficult times in those days, and we're very fortunate to be here. So that's very pleased to be here. Thank you.
My parents were both taken to Siberia, and I only really learned the full story, the historical story, very recently. I knew my parents' story, that it was told very much in isolation. It was a story about family survival during war, and so I believed it was really just their own experience. I didn't really know that there were hundreds and thousands of people that were taken at that time until I started research when my father told the story to me. He was really quite old by then. He's not able to tell his story here today because he died about 18 months ago. Now my parents are Jewish, and they were from Krakow. When the war broke out, a few days after, my father and his 2 brothers headed for Lvov. And they were one group called the Divisions. They were really the refugees fleeing the advancing German army and heading east. It's a choice they made. They thought going east was safer than waiting for the advancing army. My mother followed a couple of months later. By that time, Lvov was already taken over by the Russians. She had to swim the river cross the border to get into Russia. Now, some people here in the audience would have known my mother. She was a very nervous, very introspective person, and for her to have done that was quite a feat. They settled and they married in Hull, and they worked there until the night of the 30th of June 1940, when the Russians came for them. And the reason my parents stayed there was that they didn't have papers to stay in Lvov. They were refugees. My father's brother had married someone who lived in Lvov. He was allowed to stay. Another brother had moved to Charnakov, and others were hiding or on owning papers. So they were taken in that transport. At the railway station, my mother's brother was there as well. His papers hadn't been of much use. He was also transported. My parents went to the Aldan camps in the Yakutsk province, which is in the tiger forest on the Arctic Circle. I see some head nodding, so perhaps we were in the same transport. It's interesting that there are people here who have had similar experience, yet we never talked about it, and they never met. My parents didn't meet you, you probably never met my parents. I've got a little bit of first-hand account of some of their experiences, and I might just read you a little bit here. My father saw it very differently to my mother, by the way. She saw it very negatively, he was more positive. This is the journey. My father says, each wagon carried about 40 people, and we were given food and money to buy bread, soup and other rations at various stops along the way. We were able to cook on small ovens set up inside the wagons. I noticed my mother, and I bought a wooden bed and mattress stuffed with hay which we slept on. There were guards on the train, and although we were under some kind of arrest, they were not brutal and let us off the train to perform natural functions and to buy food. My mother, on the other hand, wrote that they travelled for several weeks in appalling conditions, that they were padlocked in the wagons. And they travelled for 30 days. The Yakutsk is one of the coldest cities on earth. But from what I've read in the history, about 100,000 refugees were transported to the labour camps in the Yakutsk region, which included the Aldan camps, which were in some of the wildest country of Siberia, specialising in gold mining and lumbering. And then my father writes about the camps. We were in Siberia to work. Honey and I were placed in the same labour camp around the big village of Aldan. We were given a small private room with a board for a bed and a mattress. There were 300 people in that camp, and they made categories of work according to how strong people were. The main work was in the forest. So some were put to work cutting down whole trees, while others just cut the branches. We were paid for the work we did, and we could buy soup at the barracks. Sometimes we could buy meat or an onion or a carrot at the market in the nearby town, which we were allowed to visit every Sunday. Honey sold for clothes for food. Our daily bread rations were 800 grams for me and 400 grams for Hanya. It was not so bad, really. All of Russia was struggling to find food at that time. My mother, on the other hand, writes, or told me at the time, we lived in a forest under terrible conditions, lacking water and controlled by the authorities. The men worked in the forest, the women on the road. The climate was extreme. Summers were short but very hot, with white nights. In winter, the temperature could fall to minus 65 degrees centigrade. There were a lot of cases of frostbite of hands, legs and faces. We were given a ration of bread, not too much, and once a day we had some Leo. We somehow survived with the help of the local population who were very sympathetic. The forests were really wrapped to the tiger restrict for thousands of kilometres. Just one more aspect I want to read to you about my father's one of the stories that my father told, the local population were very sympathetic and kind. And he met a family who he has a photo of, till he carried out of Russia with him. He found out they had a sewing machine, and he could sew his mother to put him to sew. So he sewed gloves, and he sold gloves, and that helped him to get extra rations and to sew. Now, when the amnesty came 10, my parents travelled south to Kazakhstan. They said that after the cold of Siberia, they wanted to go somewhere warm. They didn't speak of trying to join the Aneta. I mean, one point my mother mentioned it once, but I didn't get a sense that either they got there too late or they weren't accepted. I'm not quite sure how it happened, but they ended up settling in Kinst, where there was a Polish delegation, and they worked with the Polish delegation, opened up a school, and my father was a bookkeeper who worked in the accounting area. And then when the Russian revolt fell apart again after vacation, they also got the Polish delegations were closed, and again they were nothing. They managed to find work. What happened after 1943 was that there was pressure put on them to take up Russian citizenship. My father didn't want to do that because he feared he'd never get back to Poland. My mother, on the other hand, wanted to look even just for peace, but he resisted. He was taken to jail. A couple of months, I think, he was in jail. My mother was able to visit him, so I didn't get a sense that it was sort of, he was thrown away, he was lost and disappeared. But after a time, he reckons they never did, but she said that they did at some point agree that they would take up Russian citizenship. And that could be why they weren't repatriated back to Poland until 1946. Now, for them, their experience of Russia and the Siberian camps, in retrospect and in context of what they learned later, of what had been going on in Poland, what had happened to their families, they saw their deportation as a blessing in some ways. The two brothers, my father's brothers, had stayed involved. One was shot in the Tinsky Woods, executed when the Germans came over when they crossed over into the eastern part of Poland. Their preferred method was mass execution, bullet to the head, no mass graves. And I think that's a story that's also coming out now and being told about the treatment of the Jews once the Germans invaded that part of Poland. The other brother was taken to my house of him perishing there towards the war. One of my mother's sisters involved was betrayed. She was in hiding, she was betrayed. I think she perished in Auschwitz in the end. And when the brother who also went to Russia, he went to the Kula plant, we never heard from him again. So my mother assumed that he didn't survive. And if he had survived, he would have tried to return and find his family. When they learned of the horrors that had befallen the family and of my grandparents were executed in the village in Krakow, which is in Krakow, by comparison they had been lucky, and in the end their lives had been saved out, and I'm grateful for that because I'm here and I had them as my parents.
Time for audience to ask some questions. Please address them through by name, so I can point to the right person to answer them. Yes, sir.
One question. Only speakers with very interesting stories known to them from memories of parents and friends, and looking in all the speeches, well mentioned about those Poles and Polish citizens which have been in Russia in Siberia and who not being able to join understanding, joined later the Polish army, and as one of them, I 17, when I was invited by the interpreter to spend some time free of charge in Siberia and work in the Tiger. While it is so that in the communist regime, to mention Monte Cassino or cutting was a criminal offense, and now to mention the other part of the story, the 140,000 Poles who moved against the Germans in 1943, which are now considered suddenly communist fighters. I can assure you that being 20 years old, there is no political affiliation, and if the devil told me to go against the fight against the Germans, I would go, because I was aware that everyone might be. On such occasion, it is always somehow something missing. Missing the other part of the troops. If we are getting half of the troops, it's a danger that we can have. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to just pick that one up by thanking you for standing up and mentioning this part of the history, which is very important. The Kresy-Siberia group, you'll notice, has a virtual museum at the website. We've divided it up to 25 different chapters of this whole Odyssey. One of these halls or chapters of the Odyssey is actually about exactly what you mentioned. It's the Battle of Lenino and it's the Polish division under General Berlin. I think that what's happened in the past, just quickly produce the context for you, and I hope you'll agree, is there was a real division between the Polish people, I suppose, who ended up in Poland and those who ended up in the West. Communication was constrained. In fact, if people in the West were writing or communicating with people inside Poland, the Polish people would be suspected of being spies for the West, and so the communication was actually cut off by the Iron Curtain. And what that meant is for many years, people in the West didn't really know that much about what the Poles went through under communists and, who went out to Russia. The only way they couldn't join Aneta's army anymore. That got cut off, so they went out with, fighting Hitler under the Soviets. Similarly, people in Poland didn't really know the experience of people who had, no homeland to go to, maybe sometimes they thought as well, that's great, these guys are out in the West living the life of Riley, and the streets are paved with gold, why don't they come back to Poland and help us rebuild the country? So there was a real kind of schism, which only after 1989 just started to dissolve. And in fact, our headquarters is in Warsaw for that very reason, is we're trying to build the bridge back with the generations. Sometimes one brother was in Berlin's army, one was in Andrew's army, another one was in the Battle of Britain flying with the British Air Force. And other ones were in Africa at refugee camps. And there were also those who never made it out of the Soviet Union and are still, the descendants are still there now, hanging on a little bit to their Polish culture, but have never been able to return to the homeland. For us, it's important that all of these stories are shared. Thank you.
Have a question?
My is Danuta more than 14, more than shoot. Ja ten film, który nam widzieliśmy, jaka przeszła sama od 10 zerwowych. Od 1 września, jak wojna się udziela. Mój ojciec był oficerem, porucznikiem i on przyleciał do domu i powiedział, co się stało, że główny kolejowy ten był, wszyscy byli właściwie żyli, bo to była żydowska dzielnica Koda i oni, Niemcy, tak mieli wspaniałą knowledge of where the Jews were concentrated, and they destroyed themselves before they started to destroy the group.
Excuse me, those people here don't understand Polish.
But
and is there a question, or should we take it as a comment?
no, I understand Polish.
No.
No, I would like to say that actually, ja znałam pana ojca, bo był nadętym w Palestynie i mój ojciec był dyrektorem szkoły.
Perhaps you can have a conversation with Stefan.
Aneta says she knows my father, her father knows my father. Well, you know my father. He was the same age as you. But we'll have to talk after.
Okay.
For sure.
Thank you.
I like a very short comment. It was mentioned by someone, I don't remember, sort of ironically, that some of these people that went to Russia were refugees from Germany. It is true. I was 4 years old when the war started, and we were refugees from Warsaw. My father found himself in Białystok, which was taken by Russians, and we were illegal refugees to the border between Germany and Russia. And if it wasn't for that we went to Russia, I wouldn't be here, because out of all the family, nobody survived. They're all finished in Krystyna. So let's not forget that unintentionally perhaps, but the Russians saved a lot of Polish Jews.
We'll take it as a comment. Thank you. Yes, lady here.
I forgot to comment on the question.
That's a comment.
First of all, I'd like to know how many men do you have in your organization? And secondly, how do you recruit the members? Do you have a publication? Do you distribute that newspaper, flyers, and also you have better high-ups because the young refugees survivors will be there every 70 times. So you better high-ups if you want to have
There is information available from
well, I haven't.
and also afterwards you might want to speak to the members of Kresy-Siberia. The lady back there.
I just want to mention, I was very interested to hear your story because my parents also went to Białystok and went to Siberia. And what I wanted to just mention is a couple of years ago there was an excellent film at the Jewish Film Festival called Saved by Deportation. And I think you can look up online, you can Google it, Saved by Deportation. And out of 3.3 million Jews in Poland before the war started, about 0.3 million, about 300,000 fled towards the Russian border to Białystok and other places, and were captured and taken to Russia. And that was the majority of the Jews out of all of Poland that survived the war. So it was a very major thing.
If you can have a quick comment, just Rabbi Michael Shildrick wasn't able to come tonight, but he had dinner with us today, as you might know, he's in Melbourne. And I think he put it very aptly. He said, it's quite interesting because the same experience that was lived by Polish Jews, Catholic Jews, Ukrainian Polish Jews could be seen very differently because of the context of what the alternative history would have been for them. It's a comment on just what is. The same experience being sent down to dig gold as a 14-year-old boy, and your father dies, and all this. is seen in different ways. And I guess part of the reason that we're here today is that we actually want to share that and explore that. That history can't be denied. It was a terrible thing, but it was the only thing that saved their lives. And again, many Poles would have died who were deported, but also those who survived who were here to tell the story. But it's just different. It's a different perspective, and we need to appreciate that.
Speak up.
What about Jewish people?
The question, I guess, is how were Jewish people treated in the Andes army?
As far as I know, they were not. Perhaps somebody would like to correct me, but a lot of Polish Jewish people came with us and with the army and with us we were refugees for 10 years. I think most of our doctors and dentists were of Jewish faith.
There are, when you go to the Monte Cassino cemetery, there is a Jewish section of the Polish army of people who were Jewish. I think if I was a historian, I'd quote statistics and I'd say proportionally less Jews were in the army than were in the population and who were deported. And then you say, well, why is that the case? We know that the Soviets actively blocked and discouraged Polish Jews from joining the army and from evacuating because they didn't consider ethnic groups who were Polish ethnic as being truly Polish to be allowed to go. So if you were Ukrainian, you had to pretend you were Polish to get out of the army. If you were Jewish, you had to be given a crucifix and smuggle your way on, which often some of the Polish people gave, somebody was telling a story at dinner today. But your question was about politics. In Andrew's book, he writes that he had to issue directives that there was to be no discrimination. People will debate, did he mean that? Was he forced to do that? Was there some anti-Semitism? Yes, there was some anti-Semitism. But the official policy was not that. And we had Jewish soldiers, so they must have got in. We had Jewish chaplains in the army, so they must have been there. What actually happened on a day-to-day basis is human nature and human attitudes, but that's not politics, that's behavior.
I was not a Democrat also out of the Soviet group, but I had one with the Descendants of Polish Airmen. And I run a group online group also of Descendants of the Polish Squadrons. And surprise, surprise, we've got at least 6 descendants of Jewish Polish Airmen. And all of them came through Siberia. And so there was an acceptance of it. But I have also read that there was an active wedge politics policy by the Soviets in how they treated sort of the Polish minorities in sort of the recruitment into the army, who they allowed, who didn't. Because when somebody was recruited, they had to go through kind of a panel. I also know that one of the Siberians here in Melbourne, I just recently interviewed her. Her husband was a Polish Jew who was also a dentist in the Polish sort of camps in India. So it's, somebody says to me that, because one accepted a role into the Polish armed forces, there are too many exceptions to the rule to basically support the fact, because I know personally of these 3 in the UK, descendants of Polish Airmen. Actually, one of them was also here in Melbourne, Polish Airmen. Sorry? Yes. I was just saying, just clarification. And also a couple in Canada as well. So.
We'll keep this to the last question, and there's more to come. Yes.
This is just a very quick comment of what Krystyna said. I'm from the Polish Museum and Archives in Australia. My father was in the tanks in the first Polish army. The whole war, he was in the same tank with a Jewish gentleman who ended up a general in the 7-Day War.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Daniel Brown.
and gentlemen, I'd like to thank very much the Australian Society of Polish Jews and their Descendants and the Kresy-Siberia Foundation for inviting me here, for organizing this event. I would also like to thank the Jewish Holocaust Center for hosting it. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here tonight. Thank you also for coming to listen. And I think it's a very important event, very moving because of the testimonies, and I think also very important in the sense of bringing the Polish and Jewish Australian communities together and increasing their understanding. And also I'd like to express my respect for the survivors of the deportations, who are here, many of them actually, and also the Holocaust survivors, some of whom may be here as well. I have been asked to talk about Polish history today, which of course is a very broad and fascinating subject. So I will just highlight some chosen aspects of it for you. But I think when we talk about it, we have to make just a